Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Simon Mills. I'm a senior associate at the Zien Group, and I'd like to welcome you all to this long finance webinar on protection gap entities, saving disaster insurance in a time of climate change. Now, I am joined by Professor Paula Jarabowski, who holds a chair in strategic management at the University of Queensland Business School. Professor Jarabowski is an expert in insurance and reinsurance markets, and she's published widely. Her works include the widely acclaimed Making a Market for Acts of God, and more recently, Disaster Insurance Reimagined, Protection in a Time of Increasing Risk, which explains how the insurance industry and governments can better work together to address the growing threats of extreme weather and terrorism. Now, as always, the agenda for this webinar is very simple. Following my brief introduction, Paula is going to make her presentation, and then we will move on to the Q&A discussion. Now, I'm afraid that you are all muted, but you are able to submit your questions to Professor Jarabowski through the chat tool on the right-hand side of your screen. Please do chip in at any point of the proceedings. I'm going to be collating your questions and we'll put them to Paula at the end. Now, we're going to be recording this session and you'll be able to access the presentation and discussion at a later date. But before we move on, I really need to thank our sponsors from the FS Club, which is the premier global executive knowledge network for technology and finance, where members and their guests can meet over a glass of wine to debate key issues which impact on financial services, technology and society. It's very much like a 21st century version of the city's 17th century coffee houses. However, time is running on, so without further ado, I would like to introduce today's speaker. Paula, please tell us about protection gap entities.
Okay, thanks very much for inviting me. And let me just, I believe you can see my screen. Let me just get that up and let me talk to you a little bit about this book that we've just recently released last year with Oxford University Press. We studied 17 of what we call protection gap entities offering disaster insurance in 49 countries around the world. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that, and then I welcome your questions on what these things are doing in the world and how we might make better use of them at a time when disaster insurance is in crisis. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that disaster insurance is in crisis. As we know, you shouldn't normally hear anything about insurance. It's the hidden engine of our economies. But increasingly, you can't open a newspaper anywhere in the world without seeing these kinds of headlines where we know that the insurance sector, the prices are going up, people are struggling to get insurance, and insurance itself is withdrawing from some of the more volatile disaster risk. Now, should we worry about that? We absolutely should, because we know that insurance is critical. It's a form of global capital to help local economies to spring back after disaster. And so that we know that we can even get a spike in GDP after a disaster in a highly insured country because, you get replacement of assets and technologies. We also know that lack of insurance sets countries back decades. And the problem, of course, with the headlines is we're seeing that is that the figures are showing that in advanced economies that rely on insurance for things like mortgage and lending, disaster insurance is in retreat. So, for example, we see that 50% of people in Louisiana can't find insurance. In Australia, 12% of all households are under extreme insurance stress, meaning that 4 weeks of gross household income are necessary to buy any kind of meaningful insurance premium. So we're seeing that it's disappearing, if you like, from advanced economies. At the same time, we know that there's a lot of work going into trying to get meaningful levels of insurance in developing and emerging economies, because that will help to stabilize those economies and enable them to grow in the face of frequent disaster. But I did a bit of a savage chop on this graph just to give you some idea of the kind of challenge we're talking about in growing meaningful insurance in those countries. So what's the problem with insurance? And the way we like to tell it in this book is that insurance sits at a sweet spot. So the insurance sector over decades, centuries, has learnt to balance a lot of tensions that need to be balanced in order to offer insurance prudently and profitably. So the first one is who controls the insurance market. And typically what we've got into is that the insurance industry provides the societal protection. So it controls the market, it decides about the risk and the pricing, and then it trades that what is a social good for society as a commodity for a profit. And that's fine because the government just regulates that market to ensure that that social safety net is dealt with prudently so that the risk is being taken at appropriate pricing and other forms of kind of solvency and things. And this is not a problem. Many societal goods are provided for a profit, but clearly when something goes wrong, when a social good is provided and it's not working anymore, then governments do need to step in. So it's balancing that control and making sure the market works whilst controlled through the private sector in order to keep that balance where the government is just has a regulatory role. The other thing that is important is balancing knowledge. And I'm going to go a bit more into this. But essentially, insurance has always been a knowledge intensive industry, but it's become a lot more knowledge intensive. So what we do need in insurance is we need to know enough, but we don't want to know too much. So for example, Simon, who introduced us, if I know that Simon's house is going to be robbed straight after this event, and that's a certainty, then I can't insure Simon because I know what's going to happen to him and that he's going to bring a loss. So I need to not know so much that I know exactly who or what will have losses. At the same time, I need to know enough to have a probability of loss and what my aggregate amounts will be so that I've got an appropriate amount of capital. So we need to get this right balance of knowledge, and that's something the insurance sector's been great at over time. The other thing that the insurance sector has always done is been able to balance responsibility for protection. So we know that it's a bit of a truism that the premiums of the many paying for the losses of the few. And as part of that, insurers create a big enough collective, a pool of insureds that has enough money in it to pay for the random losses of a few. But at the same time, they bring measures to bear on individuals to make sure that they're not just free riding. So, for example, if the reason that Simon's house is going to be robbed in an hour's time is because Simon habitually goes out and doesn't lock his door, then Simon is bringing too much risk to the collective, and we'd have to consider whether he's insurable. So it's all about balancing those things. Now, in a time where we've got increasing urbanisation and high value assets, in places where we also have increasingly severe and frequent disasters. So it's a combination of climate change and urbanisation, plus the legacy of the assets that we've built. We see losses happening all over the world that put these things in imbalance. And once one goes, they all go, and then insurance becomes unaffordable or unavailable, except through a protection gap entity. And a protection gap entity is government legislated, not-for-profit insurer that is there to provide, insurer or reinsurer, to provide the backstop that allows insurance to continue being offered. Now, I'm going to show you a little bit about how those mechanisms work, just so you can understand why that's valuable. So let's think about the problem of knowledge, just that one balance. So we know that we're increasingly good at risk-reflective pricing, and that indeed that's a prudent and best practice in insurance. If you know that some area is going to flood frequently, then that's the area that should be charged more because they're bringing more individual risk to the collective. But what we end up with in an area, in a country, in a situation where we've got highly exposed properties and we've got, we've changed the way we build, we've changed the way runoff happens, and we've got climate change changing the weather, we're getting premiums like this. So, 30 to 40,000 pounds for a 300,000 pound property. So on the one hand, it's risk reflective because this is a high risk property. On the other hand, it means that as a societal good is no longer working. It puts the providing the social good out of balance because it can't be provided in a way that someone can afford. So what we see then is the kind of PGE that we see in the UK, like flood re. So something where people couldn't afford flood insurance, you can bring in flood re, and it has to take the high risk properties and subsidise them, essentially subsidise their insurance, ignoring the fact that actually they should attract a higher insurance premium. So what we do is we can counterbalance the knowledge problem of too much knowledge by bringing in a PGE to ignore that knowledge and still keep insurance going. Let me show you the flip side of that. So sometimes we can't, we want to maintain a market. So we have a market, we think we've modeled that risk, we think we understand it. But one of the problems in a very volatile risk society like we're in is that there are risks that surprise the insurance sector. Terrorism is a great example of that, because terrorism was largely given away within the bundled price of insurance. As some people say, terrorism was kind of given for free before 9/11. But then you get a catastrophic loss like that that compacts multiple lines, and the insurance sector simply has to withdraw. And here you see these kinds of things. Look, it's so volatile, we can't model it. We'll need the government to intervene. So imbalance in knowledge creates imbalance in that government or industry control of the market. So what you get in maintaining a market is this notion of, actually, we don't know enough about something like terrorism, but we'll ignore it and we'll continue to offer it with a government backstop or other ways of doing it. And here's some of the ones that you might have seen. Earthquakes being another one, where surprise losses create this kind of a PGE. Let's also think about making a market. Insurance is a for-profit sector, so it's not always incentivized to make markets in low revenue areas. It costs a lot to develop high quality models and work out how to test and risk your capital on it. And so what we see is, in some of these emerging and developing economies, is there's no incentive, because it's such a thin revenue stream, to build a model, And so what you see is maybe donor organizations and humanitarian organizations, development banks, helping to make a market. So they bring in the new knowledge. So, for example, with the Caribbean, what we saw is that the Japanese government, for example, funded the development of models, and donor governments from the UK and Germany funded the operating capital to set up an insurance company and developed the knowledge, which then allowed products to be traded into the capital markets for a profit. So what you see there is balancing the problem of making knowledge that wouldn't be made in the private sector. Of course, if you do this, if you start by ignoring too little knowledge and making a market, you'll often develop market knowledge, and you can then maybe make that a more robust or sustainable market for the private sector. But one of the complaints that people often make about these PGEs is that it's not fair. Okay, so we know that these are the high-risk properties. These are the things that wouldn't be insured in the private sector. So there's something wrong there. There's a moral hazard in us insuring them anyway. And so we get this thing, with which I agree, which is that a PGE is not always benign. If you come in and you insure high-risk properties and you subsidize them so they're not paying their full price, then a private sector person would be saying, that's a bad risk. Price shows it's a bad risk. If we bring in these subsidies, aren't we just incentivizing people to stay in places that aren't good for them to stay? We're reducing the incentive to mitigate climate change. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. Without a doubt, we don't want to just keep people in places and keep rebuilding them in places that aren't sustainable. At the same time, I wanted to think a little bit about this notion of moral hazard in a climate change environment where we have a lot of legacy assets that will be difficult to move quickly. And here's a little story from my own country. The Townsville Good Shepherd Home. So Townsville is a cyclone-prone area. After the 2017 floods, this aged care home saw its premiums increase to $670,000 per annum. Now, insurance, it's a aged care sector, so while it is a business, it's got capped fees, it's regulated, so it can't put the prices up for aged care. And so it's got nowhere to bring that money except $8 a day is coming out of for each of their residents, is just to pay the insurance premium. So they can't get more money in for their business model. They need to be insured because they are a business. And you could say, well, those old people should go somewhere else. But there isn't any alternative aged care for that many residents in Townsville. So my question to you is this a case of free riding? Is this a case of moral hazard? Is this a case of people knowingly and carelessly taking risks that others have to pay for? Or are we in a different position now where, yes, it's true that a PGE will mask effects, but is there reasons why maybe masking those effects is a necessary thing to do at a period in time? And that's something I think we could discuss. And with that in mind, I'd just like to pass over to do a little poll on this, on what your views on this are in terms of who should pay for the rising costs of insurance. And I'll hand over to you, Simon and Sasha, to run a poll on this.
Excellent, ladies and gentlemen. Well, if you could mark your preferences in now, we'll discuss the results at the end. Oh, I can see there's a bit of
Oh, I'm just
variation
going
there. It
to pop
looks
down so that
like
I can see what we're doing here. Because I think this is a really, this is when I go to talk with communities, I'd have to say that this is an area of enormous tension. People feeling, well, that's not fair, I live on the hill, or other people feeling, well, look, I don't have a choice, there isn't anywhere else I can move to. So I think that, your views are very valid here, and there isn't really a right way. Okay, so we are seeing that a lot of people, probably the majority, do think that it should be those at high risk, so that, the risk bearer should pay the price. But on the other hand, we're coming in not too far behind it with actually perhaps we should have subsidized insurance through a compulsory pool. So it seems like we're teetering on a little bit of an edge here, along with quite a strong view that perhaps we should do something else in that situation. So let's talk a little bit about, let me just bring this up again and put it back into full screen. And thanks for sharing your views with me. I found that very interesting and helpful. I don't really have an answer because I go and deal with a lot of different communities, and I try to help them work through what's going to work for them. But one of the things I would like to show you, and working with, as we did with these PGEs, is can we change the dialogue from moral hazard to moral opportunity? We know that insurance has a lot to offer in helping to improve the risk profile of people, but it's not always easily accessible to get to the levers of doing that. So let me show you how a PGE can turn that around. So we know that a PGE that works on the kind of compulsory multi-peril model will give you high levels of financial resilience, because what you will end up with is very high levels of affordable insurance, so high penetration. We see that in France, Spain, and Switzerland, for example. Now, when a PGE has to take all of the risk in a country and has to pay all of the losses, and it does that over decades, what it does do is gain a great deal of risk knowledge of the entire country, and risk knowledge that isn't for competitive advantage, but risk knowledge that can be used in other ways. So let me show you how one of our PGEs does that, uses that risk knowledge that is developed over a century. So that risk knowledge is integrated in developing the risk maps. So the hazard maps are refined, and the knowledge that comes from all the claims and losses over time go into the hazard maps used by the country. It's also integrated into land use planning. So what should be red zoned, what should be zoned in different ways according to what should be allowed to be built, because, for example, certain types of light industrial or recreational things may be suitable to be built in some areas where you wouldn't want to have residences anymore. So integrated into land use planning, because if you've paid the losses, you know what you want that land still used for, what it can affordably be used for. Also integrated into, if you know all the structures because you've paid the claims on them all, then you know what the infrastructure is that will help to, so what kinds of levees and different ways of doing runoff and valves, for example, will support flood, and what kinds of construction standards have stood up to different types of disasters. You amass that knowledge and you put it back into changing the construction standards. Another thing, and this is an interesting thing, is that some of the premiums can go towards training the disaster responders, because the more quickly and that you can contain a loss, the less, the more quickly you respond to disaster, both better for the human beings, of course, less lives lost, but also less property loss. And so it's things like training in flood mitigation, training in fire mitigation, these kinds of things that can immediately respond to the disaster and contain the loss. And finally, the thing that you might be expecting, which is using all claims to build back better. Surprisingly, that's still not a feature of all insurance, that they build back better. A lot of it is still build back to normal, bring back what you had, as opposed to build back better. The theme that I'm talking about is the Swiss public sector cantonal insurance system. And the actual logo that they have deals with these three elements. So prevention of loss in the first place through these aspects over here on the right, but also intervention, which we have here to stop the risk from getting worse, and then keeping in mind that we will always have residual risk, also intervention. And you can see the types of things that come out into this integrated risk framework, including, for example, if you want to do construction, it has to go through the insurance companies before it's permitted. So I think we've always perhaps started to think, or we've begun to think about insurance in relation to Build Back Better, but have we thought about insurance as being integrated into the wider country system of disaster resilience? And that's what I'd like to leave you with and perhaps have a discussion about, which is let's find this holy grail. How can we integrate insurance with climate adaptation? My concern is that at the moment, insurance that just builds back, and indeed PGEs that mask price and just build back, while it might be nice for the person to get back into their house, are actually creating maladaptation. The old back to normal is actually not good enough in a changing or in a climate crisis where the risk itself is changing, because you're actually building back something that wasn't good enough to withstand the disaster anyway. So what we've got to look at is how do we use all this great knowledge and understanding of risks, loss, structures, hazards in insurance, and here's where I think PGEs have a strong role to play in order to support climate adaptation. So that's one of the things that I'm working on at the moment. I'm actually working with the Resilient Homes Fund in Australia to try to understand how, and I've brought on board some insurers to try and understand how when we use government funding to rebuild, to raise, to retrofit, to buy back, are we making sure that we're making a more insurable and safer future? You can read a lot more about this in our book. If you want to take a photo of the screen, we were thankful and we'd like to thank the European Commission. They gave us a grant so that that copy, which is the e-copy, is free. So you're welcome to read that, share that with your friends, etc. And thank you to the European Union for making scientific knowledge free.
Fantastic. Now it's time for our Q&A session. I'm going to kick off with a question about state intervention in markets. The private sector is notoriously resistant to state intervention in markets. How are insurers actually reacting to the proposals of setting up these gap entities?
Yeah, so it has to be said that it's not a popular one with insurers, and particularly. So I think what if we look at this over history, we'll see different things. So the most recent PGEs are all interventions at a point in which the risk it's the too much knowledge scenario. Okay, so the most recent ones, so flood some of the interventions we're seeing to bring wildfire into PGE situation in California. Just now in Australia, we've developed a cyclone pool. These are the areas where we had a private sector market, but the risks got worse and the governments had to intervene because people can't get insurance. I think there's two things. There's the normal thing of, look, we already know how to do a market. Government intervention won't help, which is just a kind of, if you like, how incumbents have a natural inertia to change. There is also some fear that done badly, and PGE isn't good on its own. A PGE must be well designed. So I think there's some fear that a badly designed PGE, and we do have examples of that around the world, will actually make the risk worse because, they won't change the risk profile. But I also think that we need to get beyond this sort of antagonistic dialogue. There's room, and if we look at the historical ones, so the ones that set up, for example, in Spain, it's set up in the 1940s in New Zealand, it's because it would have been difficult to have an insurance market there. There wasn't an insurance market for earthquake in New Zealand in the 1940s. Nobody wanted to come into Spain after they'd had the civil war and help them to rebuild their economy. So actually it helped to grow a market, and now it's taken for granted that a certain percentage for the disaster risk just goes to the public sector pool, and they help control the volatility, allowing other insurance to work. So for me, it's how can we get beyond this antagonistic dialogue? We all know that there is a problem with insurability. So how can we work out a more equitable place for what's got to move seamlessly between the two sectors while we fix the overarching problem, which is we're in a more risky society where all of our societal protections are threatened, and insurance and its sustainability is threatened too. So insurers stand to win from this, but they do need to work out a way to have a good dialogue with government, and we need to get a bit of that mutual distrust.
Now, you've piqued my curiosity. You mentioned that badly designed PGs are damaging. What does a badly designed system look like?
So if you subsidize or you provide the price at a lower than its risk price, and that is what you will do, if you do that, and you only do that, you actually escalate the risk over time because you allow people to continue to rebuild. And this is, I mean, I think an example of this we see in the US with the National Flood Insurance Program coming about in the 1960s, but not sharing risk through public-private sector. So I think if you set up a really well-designed share between them, where everybody's got a bit of skin in the game, but this wasn't shared, and so, in that sense, it was just keeping the prices low enough that people could stay insured. But then they were rebuilding in places that got flooded, places that got windstorm, and then they'd rebuild and they'd still be able to get insurance and they'd be able to stay there. And of course, look, at an individual level, read the stories of people who've had their houses destroyed, and of course you're happy they can be rebuilt. But at an economic policy level, you're actually building up a massive debt for the country. And that's what sort of has been the situation there. I wish a few less people, when I talk to them about PGEs, would point to the bad one, and a few more people would point to the good ones, because I think what we want to do is learn from the good ones.
Absolutely. Now, I think that what I'm understanding from how you effectively implement a PGE is you actually need a really efficient and effective policy implementation system that covers multiple policy areas. So you need to look at farming, you need to look at building control, you need to look at road transport, etc. And you also need to look at building design and regulations. It makes me smile that the Swiss are the people that you've pointed out, as having a very effective PGE system. I'm less convinced that certainly with the current state of public services in the UK, PGEs would be effective here. Are there alternative approaches to addressing this insurance gap? Are there alternative um, uh, 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 models that you could use? For example, could you use yield insurance or smart contracts or something like that to actually provide this gap insurance service?
I think we are at the space where we need to reimagine, and that's how our book ends. It says, look, these PGEs didn't grow up to solve the problem we're in. They really didn't. We are in the most interesting of times in the terms of the climate emergency, the way we've got legacy assets, the um, increasing urbanization of society. So we're in a situation which, we don't like the word unprecedented. We're all a bit unprecedented out. It's all turning out to be a bit too precedented how catastrophic everything is. But I think what we want to say here is PGEs didn't grow up for this. But PGEs that have been around a while have learnt a lot about negotiating the different parties that need to be involved. So our final chapter isn't saying do what they've done. It says learn from what they've done and start in, because they've had to balance negotiating interests. They've had to think about how they can keep people inside a pool who really, have high risk profiles and what they can then do about them. So they've learned a lot, and we could learn from them to reconfigure the insurance ecosystem. Because yes, I think we need innovations. I think we need to change some of what we think about indemnity insurance. Is it realistic to expect that houses that are, if we're going to say make a house more resilient, we're going to retrofit it in ways that might make it quicker to clean out after a flood, for example? Should we really be talking about indemnity insurance, or should we be talking about some sort of capped amount for cleanup, for example? So it's changing the dialogue about what we think insurance does. So we might have different products there. Again, I mean, those none of them is a foolproof solution. I think we need to be careful about some of the things that, everything still comes at a price. This is still private sector capital, and it's going to come at a price. What can we seriously do about risk reduction? We know that price is a complex thing, but I think we need a lot more transparency about which bits of the property and its profile and where it sits go into the price. Which of those pieces could be changed to change price? I think that's a pretty big piece of work. I'm not 100% convinced that in insurance companies themselves that they use their claims data to understand what happened to their houses, collect it in a way that they can then feed into their pricing models. That's something that a PGE could be doing in the background for them. So I'm thinking either they can do it themselves, but they're probably not incentivized to, or they could start having that dialogue in a more sophisticated way so that we could lower the risk. And yeah, I think that we want to think about endowment products. What are the kind of products we could develop that would, like, say we know you're in a red zone, Simon, and we know you can't sell your house, but we're going to keep you insured because we want to keep you insured until such time. Is there some way we can use insurance as a sort of endowment product over 10 years? If we can get you through 10 years without another big disaster, have we built up a pot to help you move? So can we get insurance playing into, planned migration? So I feel like we're at an exciting time for insurance, but we need to move beyond 1-year contracts to offer indemnity insurance, rebuild your house, and then don't want to deal with you again because you're a bad risk. Yeah, that's not a sustainable business model, and it's not a sustainable social model.
Now, we're focused very much on developed nations at the moment, and during your presentation, you mentioned that lower income areas have got problems with insurability. Are citizens in the global south destined to be displaced by climate change because there isn't the necessary insurance available?
Yeah, look, this is a very complex problem, but we did study well, at the time, Seadrift, when we were doing the Seadrift, was only very nascent and really hadn't taken any risk. But we studied the Caribbean one, which had been running for over 10 years, the African pool, and we studied the Pacific one. And they developed listen, one thing I think has been amazing is the innovation developed by trying to find a product that could work for those countries. You can't indemnify and reconstruct a country that can lose 200% of its GDP in a single hurricane. That can happen. But what you can do is provide disaster liquidity. And we weren't thinking about insurance in that way before. There were some bonds and that kind of thing, but we weren't thinking about this product that can release within the first week before humanitarian aid or anything else has come together. And we studied that. And while everybody criticizes and complains because each time that you have a disaster, you see what wasn't quite addressed or what wasn't met, 78 payments in 13 years, 78 rapid payments to help alleviate the immediate effects of disaster, keep the generators running, get the food to people. I think that, and that's public sector or humanitarian, third sector, if you like, humanitarian actors, development actors working with private sector capital. I think it's something we should be, dancing on the roofs about, quite frankly. We learned to innovate, and that has made a difference. It isn't enough. But what we also trace is the trickle down. You see that mostly in the Caribbean. So you get risk professionals, you get courses, master's courses for people to learn to be risk professionals, because all of this can get funded by the PGE, and they have. They've developed, programs to develop risk professionals who understand risk management and risk control, who are embedded in governments. And I'm not saying that wouldn't have happened without insurance, but there is no doubt that insurance stimulated that set of conversations, gave the models, and paid quite some of the money to pilot the educational programs. So, there's trickle down effects, and then you start to get some micro insurance, little products for fishermen to get their boat back. That makes a lot of difference if you're the fisherman. So I think that we can see that there's no silver bullet, but we can see at least some ways that we can try to bring capital markets to want to support these countries.
Now, Paula, I did a lot of work on climate change adaptation about 15 years ago. I was particularly interested in what you were saying about the Build Back Better programs that have taken place. Could you give an example of the impact on premiums, so the kind of reductions that you can see as a result of adopting Build Back Better programs?
I'd love to be able to give you that, Simon. And if anyone on this seminar today, or anyone who watches it in the future, if you have some good examples of how Build Back Better has substantively changed premiums, please send it to me as soon as you can. I'm looking at a program right now where we are changing how we build houses that have been damaged by flood. I'd love to know how we can tie that into reducing premiums. I think we're trying to learn that in the UK now. Build Back Better's only been going on for a very short time through Floodry, but I think it's trying to learn that and to understand it. I think it's pretty challenging to do that. In some ways, we almost have to take a leap of faith, I think. We have to say, well, we built it back better. And this is where, again, a PGE can perhaps afford to take the hit to say, all right, we built it back better. We're going to assume it's worth this amount, and we're going to test it, what happens to it in the next flood. And an insurer can't do that because they don't even know if they're going to have it in the next flood, right? It's an annual contract. You fix the house, you don't know if you get it in the next one. Why don't we let these PGEs help us to test some of this and come up with some concrete and substantive data that we could then start to feed through? I think it's really at the forefront. One of the problems with Build Back Better, I think we know most about it with hurricane or windstorm, cyclone as we call it here, monsoon, which is we know most about things like the types of tie downs and nails and shutters and roofing structures that will withstand cyclones. So I think where we've got the most information about that is windstorm. Flood is way more wicked as a problem. I think fire is a pretty wicked problem too. So I think we're at the forefront of trying to find out some of that.
Talking about wicked problems, is there scope to use the PGE approach in the cyber insurance space? Because certainly we're seeing the increasing involvement of state actors in this space, and the damage that could be done through cyber attack is increasing exponentially. Is there a movement towards PGE in cyber insurance?
Yeah, I think it's a bit like terrorism. Now that we have these terrorism PGEs, most insurers actually want them to hang around. They know they can't really do it without the PGE. They've got a certain amount of capital they're willing to give, and they're able to risk share with a PGE. But do they want to just say, well, no, there's the terrorism and you've got to take it without the PGE? And I think cyber's in that category. I think there's an additional point at the moment. We don't have a big cyber market, if you see what I mean. We do have cyber, but we don't know what the cyber is that we want the PGE for, if you see what I mean. Is it something where we've already got a lot of insurers taking that cyber risk, and we want something where we want a PGE to help them take that risk? Or are we saying it's an ill-defined risk, we don't quite know what the triggers are, we're not offering a lot of product? A new PGE could help with offering product and working out how to offer product in a sustainable way, and then start sharing it with the market. So I think there is room for a PGE in cyber. I suspect we're going to need to have a big cyber disaster first before it's probably going to happen. We do have cyber trigger for property damage already, at least in the UK.
Do
They
you
have
think
a
it's worth
trigger.
coming at this from a different angle? You've got a real problem with information asymmetry when it comes to cyber, because quite often businesses which are subject to cyber attacks don't want to publicize that it's happened. And could a PGE actually pool that data and actually allow the development of more effective products?
Well, I think that is an aspect as well. I mean, put it this way: a PGE is not using its knowledge to gain competitive advantage over a competitor. It's using its knowledge to underwrite risk better and ideally bring in risk mitigation. So, and that is, really what is happening with the SIS system, right? I mean, it's used all that knowledge it's built up to be so much more than just an insurer, if you like. And in that sense, I can see the role there of a PGE on developing knowledge, working with those who maybe have knowledge of attacks, and working through that knowledge, through that data, to work out, well, what could we have done in this situation? how might that have mitigated your risk? How might that have allowed you to clean up the mess that you got into afterwards? So I think there is room to do that, and I suspect that there's quite a lot of places who kind of got a bit of a cyber PGE, a bit like, what do they call it? Here's one I made earlier. They've got one sitting on the back burner waiting for an opportunity.
Now, where is the political commitment to actually push PGEs forward? Are policymakers actually aware that this is an issue, and should the insurance market be doing more to engage with policymakers to make them aware of the issues that insurers are actually facing?
Yeah, look, this is a really difficult one. I hate, so in chapter 4, we actually deal with what makes a PGE evolve. And really, a lot of them, it's very contested evolution. They see a gap in the horizon because they're taking risks. They know there's a problem. There's efforts to try and engage with government. Look, there's a problem here. Can we deal with this? But until a disaster happens, governments don't want to deal with it because you don't get rewarded for stopping a disaster. You get rewarded for turning up with a check after a disaster. I really think we need to change that aspect as well. That is not a pre-disaster prevention mindset, is it? Because we didn't know that you were a hero because there was no disaster. So I think we really want to, I think that, this kind of thing of the Averting Disaster Award for politicians would be great. And that would encourage them to want to engage. And I suspect that, we need to move a bit beyond this mutual suspicion that I find in a lot of advanced economies. They know they need the market. It's about that balancing control. That's balancing control comes with attention. I think we need to sort of have a slightly more adult dialogue about that. And I welcome longer term political thinking on that as well. I mean, because the short termism is there in both the insurance sector because of the 1 year contracts and in the government. But the disaster isn't waiting for them.
Now, I'm afraid that time has caught up with us, ladies and gentlemen. I know that I haven't got round to posing all of the questions that you put to Paula to her. Please, we will pass those questions on to Paula. If you've got any more questions, please pass them on to us, and we'll forward them so you can continue this discussion with her offline. I would also recommend heading over to the University of Queensland Business School's website, where there's further information on Paula's work. It just remains for me to thank our speaker for their presentation, and to you, our audience, for your contribution to today's discussions. I'd also urge you to keep an eye on our forthcoming events. We've got a truly eclectic mix of webinars coming up, which includes the future of the arts and humanities on the 10th of April, intellectual curiosity, how the growth of institutions like the Athenaeum Club have contributed to the life and success of London on the 11th of April, and leadership in sustainable finance, charting a course through purpose, profit and politics on the 15th of April. You can catch up with all our previous webinars on YouTube, our website, or our LinkedIn page. We do hope that we will see you again soon. Thank you very much, and goodbye.